Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again to Eco Views and News. This week we're going to look at a very important issue of responding to climate change, but responding to a whole lot of other things too in the environment and in our circumstance. The question we're posing really is whether the solutions we're devising for the problems we're addressing are in effect worse than the problems themselves, leading to huge problems down the line. That is, problems about whether we can adjust, whether we can survive our own engineering. In particular, we're going to look today at the question of genetic engineering. And that's the question I've posed. Can we afford the hubris of genetic engineering? And in fact, I posed it a little bit more starkly in terms of, can we survive the hubris of genetic engineering? The hubris, of course, is that ancient Greek term for the overweening pride that we have in terms of manipulating things, in terms of doing anything really. It was illustrated with old Greek myths about Icarus flying too close to the sun and things like that. But basically, we've gotten pretty ambitious with things like genetic engineering, and the question is whether we can survive the consequences of the tinkering we're doing with natural systems. There is a lot of urgency for it emerging. You can see in things like the Times carry articles like this: "A warming planet struggles to feed itself," is the headline, and the article, which goes on at length, in effect says that climate change is going to be inducing worldwide famine very quickly with current means of production. We're going to have to hype up production, according to the Times. And this leads many in the Times, especially those in the financial pages, to think about investing in new kinds of technology. This is where we get a lot of the impulse for biotech these days. It's emerging in reference to whole continents, like BBC's carried news from the 2002 onward. That's 10 years ago. I mean, this isn't just overnight. It's over the last 10 years. Africa needs GM, genetically modified crops, to survive. It's in quotes here. It needs GM crops to survive. It's actually a quote from a scientist who is arguing that genetically modified crops are the only way Africa can survive. And Africa said to need them because the modern solution, which we consider to be modern agriculture, seems to be what's proposed to be extended to Africa. And what does Africa not have currently? Well, it doesn't have GM crops. And we in the Western world have them, we in the North have them. Well, we ought to extend them to Africa because that's where a lot of famine is going to emerge, according to this kind of argument. Now, it's problematic on several fronts, but let's look at what it is first. We've heard about it on several fronts, and in fact, if you're paying any attention to the news these days, you would have seen things like this. PBS carried not just one program on it, but a whole series of them. And the internet, in fact, if you get it connected, should be able to put you out to some of these things. The internet material on here is available from the PBS website. And you can see that they've run not just one program, but a whole series of programs when you get access to it. A whole series as part of the PBS NewsHour program in the evenings. Food for 9 Billion is their series title. Turning the population tide in the Philippines. Could agriculture bloom in the desert? As China's diet grows, so do concerns over safety and sustainability. Well, these are reports that you can bring up one after another, and I'd urge you to do it on your own time. Just click on the slide provided on the website there, and go out and listen to these reports. The whole notion is that we're moving towards 9 billion people, and that's a lot of people, and we're going to have to figure out ways to survive. Fortunately, the University of California TV has come to our aid very quickly with a whole series of TV promotionals. Now, these are promotionals for the University of California extension system and for their agricultural system. So we got to be careful as to what we're seeing here, and you can see some of the problems involved in it very quickly. Here's one of their promotionals. Take a look. 9 billion mouths to feed, the future of farming. Well, they're going to cast the whole future of farming in these terms, and we can pick it up as it's now available on the internet. Now, this has a soundtrack with it that's really worth quite listening to quite closely. So let's start it again here. It's really interesting to see the way they've framed it from the outset.
There's a growing population. We're going to need to figure out how to produce food in a sustainable way to feed all of those people.
The United Nations predicts that our global population will hit 9 billion people by the year 2050.
Okay, there you get the 9 billion, but notice the way she started it off. Who's we, who's they? Very interesting formulation. One of the ways you can look at the world food problem is that 9 billion people, they're going to have to figure out how to feed themselves by the year 2050. That's not the way she puts it. She puts it, we're going to have to figure out how to feed them. That's a very interesting formulation. Have they been consulted about this? Are they left out of the loop? Is something that's going to be done to them, for them? Take a look at it again. It's really quite staggering. The assumptions at the basis of her statement.
There's a growing population. We're going to need to figure out how to produce food in a sustainable way to feed all of those people.
The United Nations predicts that our global population will hit 9 billion people by the year 2050. And while it will be a challenge to grow enough nutritious food, it could also be a challenge to find and educate enough farmers to meet the demand, as an overwhelming number of them are close to retirement.
That's the challenge for me and the rest of my career and for my kids, how to grow these crops and still produce a huge amount of food out here, but not deplete any of our natural resources.
How are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology.
Farmers are educated people these days. They have to be.
California agriculture basically reinvents itself every generation. So our job with education and with research is to create that talented leadership and the scientific foundation for the next generation of inventing a new, more sustainable agriculture in California.
Well, there you get it. With all the music and all the upbeat stuff, premieres October 23rd. It's right through the TV, get through the California system. You're going to need to do what? Well, you're going to need to train new farmers who are trained in using what? Ag technology. This was slipped in by the very attractive woman that was interviewed in the process. Take a look at it again. I mean, this is staggering when you see it in context. Who was interviewed? Well, she's out there saying, how are we going to double our food supply? And basically comes up with the answer, which her voice actually declines in the process, but you can get the idea. Here it is.
Are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology. Are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology. Are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology. Are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology.
Okay, now you get the idea here. The only answer is ag technology. This very attractive woman says, young, being recruited into being a farmer, no doubt, going to be part of the farming of the future. How are we going to double our food supply? The only answer is ag technology. Well, there are a lot of other people who disagree, and in fact are looking at genetically modified organisms very carefully. Instead of just promoting them, they're beginning to say, no, look, let's take a look at what's ag technology.
It's not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals. It's not not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals. It's not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals.
Okay, we get the idea here. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals. This isn't about feeding the world. This is about ag technology. This is about chemical companies who bought up the seed companies, modifying the seeds in order to grow in response to their chemicals. So it's a hugely different representation, and very different from the UC California system, which has already bought into this ag biotech thing. I mean, take a look at it. It's really staggering in its implications. If you look more carefully at this, you'll see that most of the genetic engineering is developed in order to have plants that are grown by farmers that are called Roundup ready. That is to say, they can grow when you apply Roundup to kill everything else in the field. All the weeds get killed by Roundup. But Roundup ready soy will grow in Roundup doused fields. Well, that's genetic modification, and there is a fellow who's been quite critical of it, a fellow named Jeffrey Smith. Have a listen. It's really quite staggering to see what he has put up there as a documentary, in effect, which he calls genetic
It's the most dangerous
roulette.
thing facing human beings in our generation.
GMO.
Now, this is actually a very interesting representation. Same notion of people walking, millions of them out there. And this narrator says, not how are we going to double the food supply for them, but this is the challenge to us for our generation.
It's the most dangerous thing facing human beings in our generation.
GMO, genetically modified organisms. They take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
We have hundreds of millions of acres of genetically modified crops that have been planted in the United States, and yet most people are not aware.
I found out that our food supply is genetically modified. And guess what? The food that my son ate on August 25th, 2009 was raw corn. The corn that almost killed him.
The process of insertion plus cloning creates massive collateral damage. There can be hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA.
The things we're seeing today aren't normal.
Illnesses that weren't epidemic before are now epidemic.
We have gone from food in its whole food form to food undergoing a scientific experiment.
The havoc that it will cause will be across the entire spectrum of disease.
What the problem was is I guess he said that they weren't able to process the food correctly and they would bloat up and die from it.
They can put it on the market without telling the FDA or to consumers.
It became clear that the FDA had been lying repeatedly since 1992.
It's not just an agriculture issue, it's not just a food industry issue, it's an ever-living creature issue.
And if we don't do anything within a decade, every single major crop with any significant market size is going to be genetically modified, and we're not going to know it.
The world can get rid of it. The world should get rid of it. The sooner the better, now.
We look at what they're eating, and we take out the genetically modified foods and the industry foods, and they all get better. It never doesn't work.
I don't want to be a human lab rat, and I certainly don't want my 2-year-old daughter to be a human lab rat.
It's not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals.
What have I done to my children, and what has been done to them without my consent?
Check it out. The Institute for Responsible Technology has put out this film, which you can get as a DVD, but you can also watch it online. This is just the trailer for it, but I'd urge you to take a look at this because this is quite important. Now, what's going to happen here? Obviously, we've got a whole set of people, particularly the ag schools, who've gotten their funding largely for experiments from the Rockefeller Foundation, which has been selling ag biotech ever since Norman Borlaug worked on the Green Revolution and has moved from the Green Revolution to the Gene Revolution. Big jump, conceptually and scientifically, into modifying the genetic engineering, through genetic engineering, modifying the genetic composition of plants, of their DNA, and then introducing them as crops that are sold by the same companies that own the pesticides that are being applied. Now, they're modified to work with those pesticides, but what else happens to the food chain? What else happens to the ecosystem into which they're introduced? Well, a lot of people are getting nervous about this and taking a look at whether we actually really do need industrial agriculture to feed the world. One of them is Frances Moore Lappé's daughter, Anna Lappé. You may recall Frances Moore Lappé wrote a very riveting book 4 decades ago, called Diet for a Small Planet. And her daughter is doing equally important work now. In fact, even more compelling work in a lot of ways. Take a look.
The world's population keeps growing. By 2050, we'll have to double our food production. For that, we'll need genetic engineering, advanced pesticides, and fertilizer. Lots of fertilizer. That's why at Agricon, we're working every day, hand in hand with farmers and their families. And don't you want to feed the world?
Messages like this one seem to be popping up everywhere, but who's really behind them? Turns out it's the corporations profiting from this way of farming, like those selling the pesticides, fertilizers, and chemicals. They're spending billions to warn us that their way is the only way, with industry groups like the Alliance to Feed the Future, whose members include the Association for Dressings and Sauces and the National Frozen Pizza Institute. But ask farmers who really know how to feed us, and you'll get a very different story. A heartbreaking and hopeful story that I've heard talking to hundreds of families like this one. 50 years of this myth and the lobbying dollars to support it have tilted the playing field to favor corporate-controlled chemical agriculture, giving farmers little or no support for any other path. So it's easy to understand a lot of farmers feel it's either get on board or get out. Getting on board means farmers stop practices that keep soil healthy and go for single crops. Livestock that used to be raised on the farm get crammed into polluting factories. To keep this unnatural system going, these farmers now buy expensive inputs, all from ever fewer corporations demanding ever-rising prices. It's a quick addiction. Pests become resistant, so you've got to use more chemicals. Livestock becomes sicker, so you've got to use more drugs. Soil loses its natural fertility, so you've got to use more chemical fertilizer. Then on the other side, when farmers try to sell their crops, they face only a few big buyers offering unpredictable prices. The economics don't work for long. Over the last 50 years, millions of desperate farmers have had to sign contracts with corporations that dictate their every move, or have lost their farms altogether. More and more farm income is concentrating at the top, so now only 1 in 10 U.S. farms can support a family. In many other countries, a similar thing is happening. Small farmers who buy into the promise that corporate agriculture is the solution often get trapped by debt and dependency. So yes, corporate agriculture is good for some folks, including some of the largest growers, but not the typical farm family. And that's strike one for this myth. But we have to feed the world, right? And if not this way, what choice do we have? A great one.
Well, get the point here. Yeah, ag biotech is good for the huge farmers, not good for the animals, not good for the topsoil, it's not good for the small farmer, but it's good for the big farmers. But how are we going to feed the world? She takes it on. It's really quite an extraordinary exposition here. Take a look.
We just don't see ads for it, and it certainly isn't getting the subsidies going to corporate ag. State-of-the-art sustainable farming ends this unnatural chemical addiction. It uses better practices, not ever more expensive purchases. Sustainable farmers build healthy soil by planting a variety of crops and rotating them. They raise their animals on the farm, not in cramped factories. They fertilize using compost and livestock or planting soil-nourishing crops. Healthier plants with good crop rotation also help keep pests in check without hurting the bugs we need, like those all-important pollinators. How does this choice impact everyone else? Massively. Industrial farms degrade and erode precious topsoil. 64 tons per acre are being lost every year in some spots in our heartland. They suck up huge amounts of water, a lot of it from deep underground, essentially irreplaceable. And they use millions of pounds of antibiotics, a practice that leads to dangerous new bacteria.
Okay, now there you get a huge indictment of the ag biotech route. What's it doing? It's depleting our soils of their fertility, draining aquifers of all the remaining water. Things like the Oglala aquifer, which were laid down at the end of the last ice age, are going, and they're gone, basically. And what's it do? Well, it commits farmers to using greater and greater doses of pesticides, which in the coevolutionary struggle mean there are new forms of pathogens emerging in the guts of these animals who are fed in these concentrated feedlots, these CAFOs as they're known, concentrated agricultural feeding operations, CAFO, CAFOs. CAFOs are the breeding grounds of new forms of diseases in the guts of animals who are given greater and greater doses of antibiotics so they can live, but those antibiotics and the new pathogens are passed right on to us in the food chain. Not good. Not good at all.
They also produce toxic runoff that pollutes our rivers, our oceans, and us. The average American already has at least 13 pesticides in our bodies. And thanks to chemicals in the field, farmers and farm workers have higher rates of many cancers. So the sustainable farm is better for farmers and the environment. But can it really feed the world? Study after study is saying yes. Sustainable farms produce as well, and in drought years, even better. This is important news for small farmers who already grow 70% of the world's food. To increase production, they don't have to follow the chemical path. And the future we're all talking about feeding? The industrial farm requires more fossil fuels, water, and mined minerals, all stuff that will only get more expensive as it runs out. So down the line, the chemical path not only can't work for farmers, it won't be a choice at all. Corporate agriculture doesn't reliably grow more food in the future or even today. And that's strike two for this myth. But we still haven't looked at the biggest hole of all. They say we need to double food production or we'll go hungry. Really? We already have almost 3,000 calories a day available for every human being on Earth. More than enough. And that's after wasting 1/3 of all food grown. And a lot of what is grown isn't food we eat directly. 1/3 of the world's grain is going to livestock. In the US, our biggest crop is corn, but less than 1% of all corn planted is what we eat. Most goes to fuel or feed. So staying on this track, we could increase production and still have more hunger. To end it, everybody has to have the power to buy or grow the food they need. And that's what sustainable farming is all about. Strike 3 for this dangerous myth. So the next time someone who makes frozen pizza or toxic pesticides tells you there's only one way to feed the future, tell them their story is full of holes. The evidence is clear. Sustainable farmers prove we all can enjoy healthy food, and we each have power to make this happen. We can redirect our own food dollars and the billions in public money now going into the pockets of big ag. We can stand up and speak out for sustainable farmers here and around the world.
Okay, there you have it. Stand up, speak out, buy organic and sustainable. Okay, well these are issues we're going to look at again and again, not just in reference to farming, but in reference to other kinds of engineering, geoengineering for example. But the question we put today was, can we afford the hubris of genetic engineering? And in fact, we're urged to do it because of food supply crises in Africa and around the world. But the real question is, can we survive this form of agriculture? And the answer is no, we've got to get off it fast. Thanks for tuning in. Keep in touch, online or on air. See you next week.